Greetings everyone, it is Zakes here and we are back for our weekly videos. This week we'll be talking about the recently published draft bylaws for the regulation of township economies, right? I'm sure as we are all aware, there was a recent tragic incident that befell children in Soweto, in Naledi, whereby, they bought some products from a Spaza shop and then eventually led to their death. Now, after the forensic and autopsy have been conducted, we now know that the poison that they died from was a rat repellent, right? And a specific poison that stems from, agricultural products. So, given all of these things, there have, of course, been an uproar, particularly in townships all across the country, about the safety of these Spaza shops, right? About their adherence to regulations and what the government is going to do about it. And in typical government fashion, they decided, hey, let's make some more laws, right? So, yeah. The government has released these draft regulations and, to sum them up, they really are a restatement of existing, legislation. But rather that creates, I guess, extra penalties for not, meeting those draft regulations, which are also tied to these new regulations, right? So with the draft bylaws for the regulation of township economies, you have, your standard requirements for having a permit for operation, for meeting health and safety requirements and having your premises inspected. And there's even a suggested quota, right, for certain businesses that will limit the amount of businesses that foreigners will be allowed to own and operate in a particular municipality. And, your usual restatement of already existing legislation. And the good, if I were to mention any good, would be the allowance that would be given to municipal councils to convert entire township areas into, mixed-use business areas in terms of zoning. That would then enable, much more freedom in terms of operation of businesses within these township areas, which also acts as residential areas for the people who live there. So, yeah, that is the good. And of course, the bad is an admittance from the state, right? Which is to say that they have had a hard to impossible task in enforcing these already existing pieces of law. That's this new draft legislation that was released by, the Ministry of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, that it is restating. It is merely just restating an existing legislative framework that should be followed. So it is an admission from the state in a weird way that they have been failing at their job of implementing or enforcing these laws and now regulations. So the question is, how will they succeed this time, right? How will they succeed this time? Of course they won't, because in as much as we would like for the wish list of the state in terms of its regulations to be adhered to, the nature of informal businesses is that they are informal because the costs of formalization are just too high for them. And those costs of formalization include having, for instance, if you are in a food business, for those who watched my video last week, and if you didn't, please go do check it out. But if you are in a food business, for instance, and you are selling, what a very typical product in a lot of townships, right? Fried or grilled chicken. You, as someone who is opening a corner spot for chicken dust, as we call it, cannot be able to meet the same safety and health requirements that your local KFC franchise, which it is required to meet, does meet, because the cost of you having, a dedicated burner, grill sites, and all of those things will just be astronomical. You won't be able to enter the market altogether if you were to comply with all of those regulations, which you are supposed to, right? And then that is when you have informal traders who still want to provide this service, and this definitely is a service, right? Because people are willing to patronize these people knowing that they aren't complying with these safety and health regulations, right? So the criminalization of those transactions has the overall effects of just depressing economic activity in townships, because these are places where people do not have a lot of capital to start businesses already, which is why there's such a high proliferation of informal businesses, right? Giving the whether high or low capital requirements, right, of formalizing a business. In an informal business, if you have a skill, you could be a business person, right? If you can fix or plumb, you don't have to go register to your body that regulates plumbers. You can just start, taking plumbing jobs from your neighbors. And this is the form of economic activity that is prevalent in townships, but by the government having a much more heavy hand, right, in saying if they were to have a heavy hand, because as we've mentioned, it is impossible to enforce these regulations. But if they were to have a heavy hand in the enforcement of these regulations, it would lead to the people that they are trying to help, right, to the people in townships, living much more harsher lives, right? And I think in South Africa, we have an understanding of what regulations do, because as Mr. Davey in his wonderful article that was written last week mentioned about how the apartheid era state tried these millions of regulations and to try and stifle economic activity in the townships, and it did have the effect of stifling that economic activity. But on the contrast too, it did not eliminate it, right? Even though it had the effect of stifling it in the sense that it did not grow as much as it probably would have. It did not eliminate it, because you cannot eliminate economic enterprise. Liberty just is, as I always like to say. So instead of trying to stifle it, why not try and enhance it, right? And I'm sure the state has the enhancement of the economic activity in mind, but I want us to actually look at the substance of what the state is doing to see that it is achieving the opposite of what even it would say it wants to achieve. So yeah, please do tell us what you think about the newly passed regulations, right? I know a lot of us think about particularly health and safety. We all get emotional, and rightfully so, when children pass on. But I want us to look at the issue holistically, right? About the effects of having such a heavy-handed approach to the informal sector, and look at the people involved in that sector, right? In South Africa, foreign-owned Spaza shops lease out properties from South Africans, because South Africans in most cases are the ones who own these properties, right? Those South Africans, even though you may disagree for whatever reason, because they are doing something that is not harmful to anyone by engaging in a lease agreement, but those South Africans are benefiting. And even the Spaza shops themselves, right? We are not saying someone who puts, at the very least, I'm not saying someone who puts the lives of children in danger should not be prosecuted. Instead, that is the one area that the state should be as heavy-handed on as is possible. If it is found that a certain Spaza shop owner sells products that led to the deaths of young children, they should be made an example out of. Instead of passing regulations, we should enable the criminal justice system to work. And when it does work, it will achieve the same effects as a regulation would, because once the example is set that we will not tolerate harm to whether children or old, right, then that will have the effect of preventing a future transgressor without even the need of regulation, but thinking about the consequences of harming another human being within the confines of our jurisdictions. That is my and our solution as a free market foundation. Instead of regulations, just capacitate the criminal justice system, and where harm is identified, come down on those as hard as you possibly can. But as I mentioned earlier, tell us what you think. Are you in favor of regulations? We are clearly have a certain different outlook on it. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? Please let us know what you think. And as always, remember, stay free.